It is very, very important that we recognize as a people that we have to strive to conquer power and to use it. We must lose our fear of talking about power and striving to attain it. We must lose this feeling that many of us have that to strive for power is somewhat sinful and immoral. To live is to exercise power. To be without power is to be dead. To be powerless is ultimately to make oneself vulnerable to death and destruction. Powerless people are destroyed and wiped from the face of this earth, and powerless people are dominated and exploited. If we then want to end our domination and exploitation, we must develop power to prevent those who would exploit us and dominate us from doing so. Consequently, then, we must study power, and moreover, we must develop it. So we will be discussing at length power in its development and its use, and we're going to examine what powers we as African people have available to us. To a great extent, the subject matter that we will cover today has to do with power, because intelligence is power and genius is power. And it is going to take African genius for us to get the kind of power we need to exercise our influence in the world in our own behalf as people. In order for us to exercise the necessary power in our own behalf, we must awaken the sleeping intellectual giant that lies within our breasts and within our minds as people. Some people looking at this book, Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children, sort of probably think of it as a type of oxymoron, That is the sort of joining together of two diametrically opposed ideas, like sort of saying the false truth. So for some people, natural genius and black people doesn't seem to go together. And some of us have a difficult time probably dealing with those two concepts all in one sentence. If we are somewhat uncomfortable with that, it probably points out that we have been indoctrinated to a great degree by our oppression, by our domination by Europeans. It implies, too, that we have come to believe in some myths about ourselves and about other people in this world. We must recognize that all social systems, including this one, is founded on mythologies. And mythologies are not just the falsifications of reality. Mythologies refer not just to a misperception of what is true and what is accurate. The mythology provides a guidance for behavior, provides an explanation for the world, provides understanding for the world and how it came to be as it is. To a great extent, mythology serves to motivate peoples and individuals toward particular goals and values. So the importance of mythology is not so much that mythologies may be true or untrue, but in what way do they transform the psychology and behavior and the sociology of a people. I've indicated under other circumstances that our failure to understand mythology has led to our failure to understand the work of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, where many of us wanted to get into an intellectual argument with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad as to whether whites were devils or not. And many of us wanted to split hairs over good white folk and bad white folk. And many of us wanted to argue as to whether the mythology of Yaqub really represented reality. It was not the point. The point of the mythologies of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was, in believing those mythologies, how would they motivate African American people to do for self, to gain independence, to gain power, and to gain their liberation? How would it detach us from our obsession with Europeans and things Europeans, the consumption of which helps to maintain the very power that oppresses us? Certainly whites must have known that there were some good blacks and bad blacks. They must have known that all of us were not alike. But the mythology of putting us all in the same class and category served to concentrate their power and served to organize their social system and served to motivate them to develop power and to motivate them to stand against the further development of African people. The mythology then was able to concentrate their mind and their resources so as to advance their interests as a people. And you have to come to understand then the nature of mythologies. Man is a mythical animal because man at no point yet has come to understand the universe in its totality, has come to understand why and how we've come to be here and for what reason we're here. And yet it is a deep yearning among us to know these things. And mythology often gives us a sense of satisfaction in that we have some idea as to what these things and to why they exist. This society then is built on mythical foundations. And myth turns history into nature. What do we mean by that? Many of us who are ignorant of world history, many of us who are ignorant of African history, whose knowledge of history started with the study of Eurocentric history books, and whose knowledge of history started with our own birth and experience here, have come to believe perhaps that the white man has always ruled the world, and therefore he always will. We have not recognized that the white man's domination of the world is but an instant in the long history of mankind. Yet the white man has used that short instance of his domination of us and turned it into a mythology to indicate that he by nature is destined to rule over us, even though he has never ruled over us for any great period of time compared to our own history. But those who lack a knowledge of history will be deceived by the mythology that history has generated. The political and often what passes for scientific philosophy of a culture serve a mythic function. They serve a mythic function when they maintain that a particular social order is natural and reflects the nature of things as they truly are, as ought to be. In other words, the European tries to convince us that as he dominates today, his domination represents the natural order of things and the way things ought to be. And therefore he converts his short history of domination into a theory of nature and tries to convince us then that we are naturally subordinates in that history. The underlying assumption of white supremacy is that the right of whites to dominate blacks is natural because blacks are by nature believed to be inferior to whites. Thus, the social order of white supremacy is considered to be legitimate by its perpetrators and all too often by its African subjects when it is believed to reflect or comply with natural order. This belief that the natural order of things means that the white man must be the dominant force in the world occurs in many blacks because of our conditioned internalization of basic Eurocentric mythological dichotomies, that is, basic divisions that the Europeans have thrust upon us, with which we are all familiar. I've talked about those here before under the title of complementarities, that the European seeks to develop the collective and individual personalities of African people to complement their own, so that our personalities would be mirror images of theirs. So we have these so-called mythological dichotomies that equate white with good and black with evil and with clean and dirt, of course. We're familiar with those. White with rational and black with non-rational. White with authority and black with obedience. White with culture and black with nature. And white ultimately with superiority and black with inferiority. Every discipline and every means of communication is being used by Europeans to project these mythological dichotomies, these mythological oppositions. And unfortunately, because many of us are not familiar with our histories, and unfortunately because we have been so dependent on the information of Europeans, we have been conditioned to these dichotomies, and we have internalized them. Often we've internalized them not only consciously but unconsciously, and we've often internalized them when we have even tried to refute them consciously. We must recognize then that the entire mythic structure of structures on which white supremacy is based is on these kinds of presuppositions. If black people are non-rational and we are rational, if they are less intelligent and we are more intelligent, then we have the right to rule, to control, to dominate, to exploit. And you see then the whole social order of white supremacy built on these presuppositions. You see the segregation of housing in schools, the segregation into the inner cities, racial discrimination, job discrimination, and all of the various discriminations and injustices we talk about so much being based on these ultimate mythologies. We see these mythologies motivating the very value systems of this society and motivating its interactions with us as people and motivating its very movement into the world. These mythological dichotomies serve the function of naturalizing social differences and of justifying the distribution of social goods, services, privileges, power, and prerogatives according to racial, gender, and class hierarchies. In other words, then, to the white man, because he supposedly is superior, because he's supposedly more than the black man, more should be given to him. More should be his portion of the goods and services that the society provides. The internalization of such fundamental suppositions, especially by ourselves, distorts the perception of reality, distorts our perception as African people of reality in such ways that we act to support inadvertently the ruling white supremacist regime. The internalization of these mythologies blinds most of us to our own intellectual potential and to the intellectual potential of our children. The belief in and the internalization of these basic racial mythologies and stereotypes lowers our expectation regarding the intelligence of our children and of our own genius as a people. And this lowering of our expectations in regard to ourselves as people stifles the development and enactment of cultural traditions and educational, stimulative, and training programs for awakening and maintaining our genius as a people. In other words, the belief in these dichotomies blinds us to our own reality and blinds us to our own possibilities as people. The belief in these mythologies have justified the disinvestment by this social system in the education of our children. Not only has it disinvested the education of our children and the health and welfare of our children and well-being of our children, it has blunted the demands and the drive by us as black adults to see to it that our children receive a first-rate education and receive the best that the world has to offer. It's difficult if we cannot believe in ourselves and in the genius of our children for us to get up and demand that they be given their rightful due in this society, for us to get up out of our beds or to go to the schools and demand that our children get the kind of educations they deserve. The belief in these mythologies saps us of our energies to capture the economic systems in our communities so that we can build appropriate institutions for our children so their genius can be awakened and maintained. When we do not believe in our own genius and the genius of our children, we are overwhelmed by apathy and a feeling of laziness. It prevents us then from moving forward and demanding and getting what is our due. So these stereotypes and these dichotomies that I've mentioned are not just mere slanders of our character as a people, but they become incarnated in our bodies such that they weight us down and make us feel heavy and lethargic so that we feel energyless and we cannot gain the will to fight the good fight, to achieve what our children should gain and what should have for their own advancement and the advancement of us as a people. These dichotomies have led to an absence of development, of the development of a learning theory and pedagogical theory and educational theory appropriate to the maximization of our children's intellectual potential. In other words, when we believe these mythologies that have been foisted on us by this oppressive system, when we have internalized these mythologies, we become blind to study and knowing ourselves and knowing the psychology of our children and knowing the psychohistory of ourselves and how that psychohistory is represented in what we call the learning problems of our children and the behavioral problems we hear so much about of our children in today's schools. It means then that we are disenabled in our capacity to develop appropriate educational theories and theories of learning. We do not recognize that our experience here in this country and our experience around the world has transformed the way we think as African people, the way we process information, has transformed our capacities for remembering and our capacities for recalling and learning and for processing the information before our eyes and the information that is given us in the classroom. The absence of this kind of knowledge mean that we have not been able to develop appropriate educational theories and appropriate theories of learning. And in the absence of developing appropriate theories of learning and theories of education, we have failed to develop appropriate pedagogical theories, that is, theories of how our children should be taught, how we should interact with them in ways as to maximize their natural genius as people. We therefore must rid ourselves of these stereotypes and of these mythologies that blinds us to ourselves. We must recognize then that these mythologies must not only be refuted intellectually, but ultimately they must be exorcised out of our very bodies and minds and consciousness as people. Even in this day of multiculturalism, the pernicious racial dichotomies are still destroying our faith in our children, in the genius of our children. The pseudoscientific mythology that intelligence, as measured by IQ, is fixed and unchangeable, still destroys our faith in our genius as people. Many of us still believe that the so-called IQ is fixed at birth and is fixed by our genes. And of course, when we look at what goes on in our educational institutions, we too readily believe that this reflects something about our natural state as African people. And yet, the facts point to different conclusions when we really look at our children. Let's look at the inherent intelligence of black children compared to that of white children. And let's look at some evidence of IQ change over time. Many of you, of course, who've read Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children are familiar with this, and some of you, of course, are familiar with this material from the developmental psychology of the black child. But let's just review a little and look at a study done by Gibert, a study whose original intention was to see how malnutrition and other forms of social deprivation operate against the intelligence of children. Gibert's work is described by Peirce in his book, goes as follows. She, Marcel Gibert, used the famous Gazelle test for early intelligence developed at Yale University's Child Development Center. The pictures of the 48-hour child, two-day-old child, supported only by the forearms, both upright, perfect head balance and eye focus, and a marvelous intelligence shining in the face, are no more astonishing than those of the 6-week-old child. Get what we're saying here again, that the characteristics of these black children at 2 days old, at 6 or 7 weeks, these children crawled skillfully, could sit up by themselves, would sit spellbound before a mirror looking at their own images for long periods. This particular ability was not expected in the American European child before 24 weeks, that is 6 months, according to the Gazelle test. So here again, we're looking at an intellectual and psychomotor development occurring in African children some 6, 7, 8 weeks ahead of those of Europeans. Between 6 and 7 months, the Ugandan children performed the toy box retrieval test. Gibert showed the infant a toy, walked across the room, put the toy in a tall box. The child leaped up, ran across the room, and retrieved the toy. Besides the sensory-motor skills of walking and retrieval, the test shows that object constancy has taken place, the first great shift of logical processing in the brain, at which point an object out of sight is no longer out of mind. the characteristic of infancy and early childhood. This test, successfully completed by the Ugandan children between 6 and 7 months of age, was not to be expected until somewhere between the 15th and 18th month in American and European children. There is no substitute for self-knowledge. We cannot let even the palliative statements of multiculturalism, which seeks to equate children all across cultures, blind us to our own possibilities as people. We must not let our fear of inferiority make us latch on to the idea that children are only different in their color of their skin. These kind of mythologies prevent us from knowing ourselves and from appropriately dealing with our children in terms of their development and in terms of their possibilities. This kind of study has been duplicated time and time again, not only in Africa, but in the United States and in other parts of this world. And as a number of you might know, they appear to be, the findings of these kind of studies in part appear to be connected to the melanin base of our bodies as African people. On some level, they may appear to reflect what we call in biology a theory of recapitulation, in that during the developmental sequences of the human embryo, we go through earlier evolutionary sequences. We also, in our development as an ethnic group and as a people, repeat on a certain level in our early development the developmental histories of our people. And perhaps as we see our children walking first and talking first and negotiating reality first, intellectually processing the information of this world in advance of white children and others, we may on this level may see repeated the history of African people, the first man on this earth, the first man to walk this earth, the first man to intellectually master this earth and to deal with it in terms of intellectuality and in terms of definite control and power. Let's take one other look at another study here of some Kikuyu infants. On both the mental and motor tests, the Kikuyu infants were precocious, scoring significantly higher than would be expected for American infants of the same ages. As compared with the standard score of 100 American infants, average on these tests, the average Kikuyu mental score was 108 and their average motor score 129. The Kikuyu infants bettered the standard score on 38 mental items and on 20 motor test items. They were lower than the standard on 7 of the mental test items and 2 of the motor test items. However, the researchers were under the impression that these items involved implements that are familiar to American infants but not familiar to Kikuyus. When Kikuyu infant test scores month by month were compared month by month with month-by-month scores for white infants in the United States and the United Kingdom, the Kikuyu infants performed better on both mental and motor tests throughout the 15-month period of observation than did any of these other groups. However, the superiority of their performance tapered off somewhat toward the end of that period A number of reports have suggested that sub-equatorial African infants are precocious in their motor development and possibly also in their mental development, and this study appears to confirm these reports. We'll be back to this so-called tapering off momentarily. Gibert concluded as a result of her studies that the precocity of these African children was not only in motor development, it was found in intellectual development also. It is not always realized that intellectual development is displayed very clearly in the use of the gazelle material. To take an elementary example, the child who merely looks at the cubes and then picks them up is demonstrating a series of intellectual processes, and for the building of a tower with the cubes, more complex processes are needed, in addition to the greater manual dexterity. Although most of the African children had never seen anything resembling the test material, they used it in the same way as European children that succeeded in the test earlier than those children. Their interest was lively and their personal social relations excellent. They made good contact with the tester, turning and talking, smiling, and trying in every way to communicate. So we could go on and on with these kind of studies, and these studies are abundant in the literature. There are some who, perhaps in the back of their minds, perhaps may think that, well, early beginnings may imply later slowing down. Remember, though, we are talking about human beings here, and there is evidence that these early symbols of intellectual and psychological advancement are connected to later developments and advancements as well. We'll just give you a quick sampling of a type of testing that indicates this is the case. Reading from the New York Times of April 4, 1989, titled Infant IQ Test Found to Predict Scores in School. Subtitled, Doctors are already identifying babies who are at academic risk. To the surprise of many psychologists, tests on infants as young as 6 months of age are predicting their scores on intelligence tests years later when they start to school. So when we talk about the early development of black children, we are not talking about then a development that by nature has to decline. I'm going to skip over a number of things here. In a newly completed study, Dr. Fagan and his colleagues reported that they can now test infants in the first year of life and pick out those who are likely to be above average in intelligence at age 3. So when we talk about these black children again and the precocity they demonstrate during their first years, we know that these are connected to their later years as well. Working independently, Dr. Bornstein and Susan Rose of Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York have found that a baby's performance at age 4 months and 6 months on tests of visual memory correlate with IQ at 4 and 6 years of age. They use tests they developed themselves, but that are similar to those developed by Dr. Fagan. The predictions are independent of the parents' education and income group, which are also correlated with intelligence. When we talked about the toy box retrieval test, we are also talking about, in part, what would be referred to in psychology as visual memory. Dr. Rose said she is particularly intrigued by the infant tests because they indicate that visual memory, which is already linked to IQ, in later years may be fundamentally tied to the workings of the mind. Visual memory may be a central aspect of intelligence from infancy onward. So there is no reason why we should expect the precocity of our children to decline. But the question remains, if black children have this head start that I've talked about, then why is it lost at a later age? That is, why are these children often overtaken by white children in the later years, particularly as they enter into the 2nd and 3rd grade? I will argue, and of course we don't have time to develop this in detail here, that both the African children that we mentioned and our children enter into a new cultural ethos where at certain ages where certain abilities are reinforced and others are suppressed. In other words, when a child grows up in certain cultures, those cultures differ in the emphases and the values they put on certain abilities, certain talents. And these emphases and values then serve to reinforce certain talents while suppressing other talents. And I would argue then, on a broad scale, many of our children then enter into a cultural situation where their natural genius is repressed, particularly the academic side or the intellectual side of their genius. To a good extent, many of our African cultures are what I would call conservative relative to European culture, and I know that is an arguable point, but I think it's one that we have to consider. Even within this country, African Americans, I believe, exhibit a certain type of conservatism in values and points of view. And this conservatism is reflected in the nature and character of the intellectual genius or like thereof of our children. Broadly speaking, we must first recognize that intelligence as measured by IQ is not necessarily a stable attribute and may vary widely with environmental changes and social economic circumstances. The major function of intelligence is to adapt the individual and a people to their social circumstances. Intelligence is a survival mechanism by means of which individuals adapt to their environmental demands and change their environment so as to maintain their own well-being. Given this view of intelligence, we should not expect then the intelligence of people coming from different cultures and backgrounds to be exact duplicates of one another. Intelligence cannot be defined purely by number or by academic success, for intelligence is not true intelligence unless it helps us to solve the problem that confronts us. I've indicated before that we've let people define our intelligence in terms of their own survival. The term we use for intelligence in this culture is an intelligence that is important to the survival of white folk. And we are measuring our children according to this intelligence. And this is why many of those that we call intelligent can only solve the problems of white folk, but not the problems of African people. So ultimately, intelligence must be directly tied to the nature of the problems that confront a people. And people must not be considered truly intelligent until they're intelligent enough to resolve their own problems, not the problems of others. So we must recognize then intelligence will fluctuate according to culture and experience and background.